We'll move on to our second question. This time we're going to start with Bob Gibbs. Bob, your question, and of course you have 2 minutes for this, is what is your opinion on U.S. EPA proposed regulations on greenhouse gas emissions from animals and particulate matter, in parentheses, dust, and the limitations this has for our farms?
I sponsored a resolution in the Ohio Senate to give direction to our congressional delegation not to let the EPA move forward on that. I'll give you an example. Work done by the American Farm Bureau on emissions from cattle from both methane and CO2. That's part of this proposal that the U.S. EPA is moving forward on. There would be a tax per dairy cow per year of $185. A pig, $22. I used to raise a lot of hogs, and I can count by one hand where I made on an annual basis more than $22 a year profit. And so that's going to kill the livestock industry here in the country. Then our meat would come offshore. We have no control how it's raised or produced. And unfortunately, our congressmen and the Congress really neglected their responsibility because they had an opportunity to say to the U.S. EPA, we're not going to move forward. Title V of the Clean Air Act wasn't intended to regulate greenhouse gases. They should have told them they're not going to move forward to give you carte-blanche authority to regulate carbon dioxide, CO2 as a pollutant. And they neglected that responsibility because now the U.S. EPA is moving forward, and that's going to be a job killer and cost us economy and it cost our quality of life, our standard of living. So I totally opposed to having the EPA move forward on those issues.
All right, thank you, Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Sutton, you have 2 minutes for this. What is your opinion on the U.S. EPA proposed regulations on greenhouse gas emissions from animals and particulate matter, and again in parentheses, dust, and the limitations this poses for our farms?
Maybe no surprise that I'm sort of opposed to having any regulations coming from the EPA. The regulatory authority in this country should be the U.S. Congress, not a bureaucracy. I think that in terms of the involvement of departments such as the EPA, they should keep tabs on what things are going on in our environment and problems that are facing the environment, whether they're agriculture or greenhouse gases of other sources as well. And those findings should be reported to the U.S. Congress, the people we elect, to make legislation pertinent to the problems that they find. Not allow an unelected entity to make regulations that we all have to live by. That's the basis of the way our government is set up. That's the way it's supposed to be set up. That we choose people within our district and send them to Washington, D.C. And the states used to choose their own the senators from the states. Of course, that changed in the 17th Amendment. But then the people are represented at that federal government level by those that are elected, not by bureaucracies that have been created by those who were elected in the past who didn't follow the U.S. Constitution.
Thank you, Mr. Sutton. Zack, you have 2 minutes for the question. What is your opinion on U.S. EPA proposed regulations on greenhouse gas emissions from animals and particulate matter and the limitations this poses for our farms?
Actually, this is an issue where Bob Gibbs and I agree, and I suppose Lindsey Sutton and I agree, at least in terms of the EPA's authority. I'm on a bill right now designed to strip the EPA of their authority to regulate carbon. I don't think they have it either. We want to make that specific. So I'm not going to go on for 2 minutes about my response to that question because we agree. But I'm going to go back to the last question. I feel as though because Mr. Gibbs has characterized something I've done, he says that I have essentially lied about him being a free trader. The words free trader were not used by me, they were used by him. He was asked whether or not we should repeal NAFTA. The answer was an unequivocal no. He testified before Congress about the benefits of trade with China under the existing policies. If it looks like a duck and talks like a duck and squawks like a duck and walks like a duck, then it probably is a duck, even though it calls itself a free trader or a fair trader. So Mr. Gibbs and Mr. Boehner have made it very clear they intend to do everything within their power to not just maintain the current system on trade that has been so devastating to our communities, but they want to extend these trade agreements to other countries. And in the end, if we don't stop this nonsense and how we're adjusting to this global economy, our country, this great country of ours, someday is going to look a lot more like Mexico than we like to think.
Gentlemen, I appreciate the fact that there is going to be a great deal for all three of you for the need to respond at various times, and I would encourage you to try and keep that to a minimum, recognizing that it will happen.